Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Henry Holland-Hibbert. I'm the chair of HCF, and we're delighted that so many of you are joining us this afternoon for the launch of Hertfordshire Matters. If our friends from Zoom haven't let us down, there are 229 of you out there, including many of our generous donors and fund holders and representatives from all parts of the local voluntary sector and the many charities in Hertfordshire who we are pleased to support. So a very big and warm welcome to you all from the team at HCF. Of course, we should have been doing this in person with you a few months ago, and we all know why this has not been possible. It is obviously sad for us all at HCF that we aren't with you in person, but we can't wait any longer to release the Hertfordshire Matters research and the key findings. So here we are on another virtual meeting, something we've got pretty good at over the last few months and will certainly become part of our new normal going forward. And I would very much like to thank our two sponsors who've made it possible for us to print the Hertfordshire Matters report. CCLA Investment Management, who manage part of the endowment funds gifted by many of you and held by HCF, and the John Apthorpe charity, who do so much to help those in need in Hertfordshire. Next slide, please. The slide here gives you a brief rundown on how we will present to you today. I will speak to you first, followed by Helen Gray, our Foundation Director, who will run through the key findings of the Hertfordshire Matters research with you. I'm also particularly pleased to welcome Adrian Arthurs, CEO of the Living Room, who will talk to you about their work and the impact of COVID as they seek to support those facing addiction issues. Our aim is that this will run for about an hour and we will let you go around 4 o'clock. Next slide, please. After the presentations, there will be a Q&A session with Helen Gray, Helen Dubell, our Head of Grants, Adrienne and me. And before I go further, I'd just like to explain how you can ask questions. At the bottom of the screen, you will see these icons. If you have any technical issues, please call the chat box or use the chat box and we will do our best to help you. That's if you haven't got your children or grandchildren ready, who'll probably be able to do it quicker. If you'd like to put a question to any of the speakers, use the Q&A. And if you're happy to leave your name and address, with your question, please do so. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end. Next slide, please. Some background for you. The vital research which we carry out as part of the Hertfordshire Matters programme allows us to fully understand our local communities and the key social issues facing Hertfordshire residents. We published our first needs analysis back in 1996, and since then have produced 3 further full publications. The findings and results that come forward through Hertfordshire Matters underpin every aspect of HCF's work, from grant making to the strategic advice we provide to donors. It is used to shape HCF's grant making strategy to ensure that our grant making delivers real impact and addresses identified need. It also provides evidence of need to support local groups as they seek to secure further funding. Whilst we are disappointed not to be launching this research back in March, it has become even more important since the lockdown began. In response to COVID, the National Emergency Trust, or NET, kicked into action very early on. From the NET, we in Hertfordshire have been allocated over £400,000 to pass on in grant funding to charities in need in this county. In addition, our own HCF appeal has raised a further £250,000 from our own Hertfordshire supporters, and for this we are truly grateful. So in total, we have the opportunity to distribute over £650,000. Over half of this has gone out already, and the remainder is going out weekly as the grant applications are received and further needs arise. Now, it is particularly satisfying for the Community Foundation structure as a whole that we have been chosen as the organisation to distribute NET funding. And some of you may not be aware that we are one of 46 community foundations across the UK. And this is where our Hertfordshire Matters research has been put to so much good use. We have up-to-date information as to where the areas of deprivation are, where the needs are greatest, so we have been able to target our grant funding accordingly to those charities which are meeting the needs of the highest demand. HCF has supported over 120 groups and organisations, providing frontline services to some of the county's most adversely affected residents, and this work continues. From our recent grant making, almost without exception, all the issues highlighted in our research have become heightened, including poverty, domestic violence, and isolation. To support our work further, we have conducted a COVID-19 survey of the local voluntary sector, which attracted 236 responses. This has given us valuable insight into current needs. For example, charities assisting the elderly have had particular difficulty in reaching those in need. Clearly, physically, this has not been possible, but so many have no form of modern phone, tablet, or laptop equipment, and also don't know how to operate it necessarily. So a whole new learning culture has had to develop. Many charities have found the ability to make quick decisions and get on with new initiatives particularly refreshing. Trustees and boards have adapted quickly to changing needs, and red tape has been cut out of the way. Many of us have heard how domestic issues have been far higher during the lockdown, but isolation has also been a much greater problem, especially for the elderly living alone. Our survey has shown us of food banks with over a 200% increase in the number of applicants coming to them for help. But we've also seen kindness in other ways with, for example, Travelodge opening up many of their rooms in their Watford hotel for the homeless. Helen will highlight some more of these findings as she talks through the themes of the research. Hertfordshire Matters is part of a long-standing commitment to the county to highlight hidden need and to encourage local philanthropy and make a difference to our local communities. Next slide, please. We decided to produce a new report to coincide with the publication of the latest indices of multiple deprivation last autumn. Now, you might ask what the IMD data is. Well, since 2004, the UK government has measured how deprived different neighbourhoods are compared to one another. This data is known as the Indices of Multiple Deprivation, or IMD data. The IMD is the official measure of relative deprivation for small areas, neighbourhoods in England. It considers multiple sets of data to come up with an overall rank for deprivation. These include data like how much people earn, what level of education they have, how much crime takes place in the neighbourhood. Therefore, how deprived somewhere is depends on multiple factors, all of which are covered in Hertfordshire Matters. When the IMD data is released, we commissioned Oxford Consultants for Social Inclusion, or OCSI, to pull together the necessary information for our report. OCSI is a spin-out research consultancy from the Social Disadvantage Research Centre at Oxford University, and they are also involved in producing the IMD data on behalf of the government. Taking this data and other research we've completed ourselves, we produce our Hertfordshire Matters report. We do this to test some of our assumptions about the county and to ensure our grant-making practices are fulfilling our intention to make Hertfordshire a better county for everyone. It is also a valuable opportunity to see which areas of social need have improved and which areas have declined. Now, you will all be mailed a link to our report before the end of the week, and hard copies are available on request. In addition, there is a more detailed version on our website should you wish to delve deeper into the data itself. Next slide, please. Our Hertfordshire Matter report looks at 7 core themes. These themes were identified as critical to the health and vitality of the wider county. From child poverty to homelessness, there are significant challenges facing some of our residents, despite Hertfordshire appearing to be a universally prosperous county. And for the first time, we also look at our environment. Is Hertfordshire meeting environmental needs and meeting the challenges for emissions and pollutants going forward? We need to provide a stable environmental background for all our communities. I will now hand you over to Helen Gray, our Foundation Director, who will share some of the report's highlights with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Henry. It's brilliant to have you all with us this afternoon. Before I begin discussing the first theme of our report, I just wanted to set the scene and tell you a little bit about Hertfordshire and how our population has changed. So Hertfordshire is actually one of the most densely populated non-urban counties in England. And if you look at the number of people living per hectare, Hertfordshire has almost double the number of people per hectare than the rest of the country. Hertfordshire comprises of 10 districts and (1,500 people. The population of Hertfordshire has grown by 5.8% since 2011, and that compares with an average population growth of 5.4% across England. So Hertfordshire is actually growing at a faster rate. If we look back at the year that HCF was founded, which was just over 30 years ago, the population has actually grown by 20%. And the projection is that Hertfordshire's population will actually continue to grow at above the national rate across all age groups, but particularly in the over 65s. And it's estimated that the over 65s population will grow by 23% over the next 10 years. That's a really significant growth in the older size end of our population. That will place a very significant strain on existing infrastructure and services. And Louise, if we now look at the next slide. Sorry, if we click on one slide again, that'd be great. Brilliant, thank you. Deprivation is one of the first themes in our report, and Hertfordshire still has a lower than average proportion of households in poverty. But in the 4 years since our last Hertfordshire Matters report was published, all 10 districts have shown an increase in levels of relative deprivation, with Broxbourne and Stevenage areas seeing the greatest increases. 45 neighbourhoods in Hertfordshire are now among the top 30% most deprived in the country. And Borehamwood Cowley Hill, which is an area we've previously reported on, is the most deprived neighbourhood in the county. And it is now the only neighbourhood which is actually ranked in the top 10% in England, where 1 in 3 residents is income deprived. Hertfordshire neighbourhoods show higher levels of deprivation in relation to barriers to housing, which we'll talk about in a minute, and services and living environment than any other type of deprivation. And Waltham Cross sadly has the highest rate of child poverty, where over 20% of children aged between 0 to 15 are in poverty. And we've stated in our report that 25,000 children are estimated to be living in poverty at the moment, which I think is a really shocking figure in 2020. And I also suspect it's a conservative figure. We've also seen over recent years an increase in in-work poverty, especially amongst lone parents or couples where only one parent is in work. And obviously that has a really significant impact on the children in those families. And just looking at, sorry, if we can click onto the next slide, Louise. Just looking at some recent headlines, which I've dotted throughout my slides. The first headline, nearly 2 million claims for universal credit, and coronavirus will cause child poverty to soar. So clearly COVID is going to have a very big impact on deprivation. According to the Child Poverty Action Group, which is the second article headline there, the chief executive is quoted in that article as saying by 2010, the UK was halfway to achieving its target of cutting child poverty to 10% in 20 years. But 10 years of austerity has resulted in a £40 billion annual reduction in spending on social security. And this is a bit I find really shocking. He goes on to say, we have more food banks in the UK than we have branches of McDonald's, and homelessness is rising. That's one of the reasons why HCF has a children's fund. I think the founder of the children's fund, Joanna Mason, may be on this call, and if you are, hello. She had the amazing idea that we could set up a fund purely dedicated to supporting families in crisis. And I work very closely with Maureen and the team, and we've seen a real impact already of COVID from applicants who are maybe furloughed, they've lost their jobs, and their income has therefore been cut dramatically. We also know that food banks have seen an unprecedented rise in the number of people using their services since lockdown began. DENS is a charity based in Hemel, which provides accommodation to homeless people, and it also provides an amazing food bank service. In March and April last year, they supported 998 people in that period. Looking at March and April this year, they supported over 1,500 people. So that's an increase of over 55%. And HCF continues to very actively support frontline service delivery, including food banks. In our recent voluntary sector survey that Henry referred to, 25% of local groups and organisations have actually ceased operations entirely as a result of lockdown, while 30% have increased their service delivery, and of course that would include things like food banks and those charities providing frontline services to support the elderly and those facing loneliness and isolation. If we now look at the next slide and we move on to housing, this is perhaps one of the sections of the report which makes even more gloomy reading, I think. The recent UK housing crisis has been really well documented, and here in Hertfordshire, affordability and availability of housing are long-standing issues. Access to decent housing is a real issue for many, and the population has, as I've already said, grown faster than the national average, and it's also grown faster than housing supply has grown. So demand for social housing is extremely high in certain parts of the county, and that has been exacerbated by a reduction in the number of social homes in certain areas. Levels of statutory homelessness have nearly doubled in the county since 2009. And there's also been a significant increase in the number of people in temporary accommodation. And rough sleeping levels have also increased. It's a very visible sign of poverty and deprivation, and are more concentrated in urban areas. And in 4 out of 10 districts, it's above the national average. There's been a staggering 96% increase in statutory homelessness in Hertfordshire since 2011. And it's estimated, and again, I would imagine this may be a fairly conservative estimate, that there are about 213 people sleeping rough in the county, and that was based on a count done in 2018. Broxbourne is ranked among the top 10 districts in England with the highest levels of homelessness, with more than 1 in 100 households in the area living in temporary accommodation. And that's actually 3 times the national average. Watford shows the highest rates of rough sleeping of all the districts in the county, with about 3.5% per 10,000 households. And again, that is well above the national average. There's been a huge amount, if we could click onto the next slide, Louise. Thank you. There's been a lot in the press in particular about housing. And while the government announced a £6 million homeless response fund in May, which was of course very welcomed, it's not going to be enough to tackle homelessness across the country. Henry's already mentioned New Hope, which is a fantastic charity in Watford, and they managed to get 80 vulnerable people off the street at the start of lockdown, and they've been accommodated. And Resolve in Hatfield, I think Joe Heaney may be on the call, also has done a tremendous job at stopping people having to sleep rough during this time. But what will happen when lockdown ends? And of course, there's a huge concern, and it would be a tragedy to see that people who have come off the streets, who've begun to recover from physical and mental trauma, find themselves back on the streets again. And then if we look at health and wellbeing, On a more positive note, life expectancy in Hertfordshire is generally higher than the national average. However, your life expectancy varies hugely depending on where you live in the county. A male living in Aldenham, Hertfordshire, will on average live 11 years longer than a male living in Pear Tree, Welwyn Hatfield. A woman living in Welwyn North will on average live 13 years longer than a woman living in Holwell, Watford. And they are really big disparities, and you know, a significant number of years. We also know that good mental health is essential for a flourishing society, and yet mental health continues to be a major concern. In fact, it's a national concern. In our last Hertfordshire Matters report, we quoted a figure which we're still quoting, which is that 1 in 4 adults will experience some form of mental health illness at some point in their lives. And I think with COVID, that probably will be true for many people who perhaps haven't previously experienced mental health problems. Across the east of England in 2017 and 18, there were 5,600 reported winter deaths, of which 795 were here in Hertfordshire. And that's for a number of reasons, but it's partly due to poverty, poor living conditions, lack of access to heating, and fuel poverty. And that's one of the reasons why HCF has a winter appeal. I know lots of charities have appeals in the winter, but for us it's to primarily tackle fuel poverty. And having met some colleagues from across France, Spain, South America, where they also have community foundations, they were all shocked to hear that we have fuel poverty here. It's not universal around the world, but it's definitely an issue in the UK. The county also has a higher incidence of dementia than the national average, with 9,500 people aged over 65 diagnosed with dementia. Younger children in Herts are also slightly more likely to be admitted to hospital for mental health related conditions. And in our recent survey, one of the questions we asked, and I know many of you responded, we asked people to rank the needs of local people as a result of COVID. And perhaps not surprisingly, the overwhelming single issue that everyone has come up with is that we anticipate there to be a huge spike in mental health problems. And it's not specific to any age group, it will be across all ages. And if we just look at the next slide. So we don't yet know what the impact of COVID will be, but we can begin to imagine what some of the issues will be. And these are headlines from national press and local press. And obviously they're the first headline, a teacher is really concerned about the impact of mental health after schools closed. And of course, for some children who have not been able to do their GCSEs or A-levels, or families living in poverty where they don't have access to computer facilities to do home schooling, it's a massive issue. And it will cause quite a divide, I think, once again, between those from more affluent areas and those in poverty. The other area we know has been a huge issue is that COVID has affected BAME communities particularly badly. And in relation to the National Emergency Trust funding, which Henry has talked about, which all community foundations across the UK are distributing, they reported yesterday that 17.4% of all their funds have been distributed to groups whose primary audience is BAME focused. And that's of course something that HCF will keep a very close eye on. Our survey also identified other issues which are emerging, including substance abuse and drug and alcohol addiction. And on that note, I'm really delighted to introduce Adrienne to you, who will talk a bit about her work at the Living Room.
Hello, thanks Helen. I'm Adrienne, I'm the Chief Executive of the Living Room. We are a 20-year-old charity that provides abstinence-based, free, non-time limited addiction group therapy for people with addictions. The groups are facilitated by trained counsellors with lived experiences themselves, and we support people across Hertfordshire. We don't just support the person with the illness of addiction, but we also help to support the family and the carers. We're able to help people that have a dependence addiction, such as drugs and alcohol, But also we support obsessive and compulsive behavioural addictions such as gambling, disordered eating, spending, gaming, hoarding, exercising or working excessively, sex addiction and self-harm. Because what we do is to help the person address the root cause, focusing not on the drug of choice, but on the underlying issues. Addiction may have complex causes, including inherited biological, as well as social risk factors working in tandem. Unless dealt with, addiction remains a chronic condition, incorporating cycles of relapse and recovery, which has a negative impact on children and families, and is destructive upon communities and future generations. At the Living Room, we know that recovery from addictions is possible with a range of cognitive tools and the appropriate networks. And at the heart of what we do is to reconnect and revalue self-belief. And we don't just do this alone. We work in partnership with other organisations to support people holistically and address social risk factors and issues. COVID has had an added effect upon people who were already suffering with isolation that addiction brings. Our model is face-to-face group therapy, but this was no longer viable. We knew that in order to maintain positive connections, we had to keep providing a service, bringing therapy into people's homes via video conferencing. HCF has provided some of the funding to help us to do that, to bring new clients to the new virtual way of working at a time we needed it the most, essentially holding someone's hand to learn how to access the very real work that happens in group therapy. During lockdown, we have seen more people reaching out for guidance and support, and an increase of 15% compared to this time last year. Whether it's due to being stuck at home in a desperate situation, lack of supportive networks, a realisation of dependency on negative coping strategies that have been exacerbated in lockdown, or that increased anxiety and lack of being able to control the underlying issues has made people reach out. Knowing that they are able to access online therapy has been life-changing for many, despite the technical hurdles. Travel is no longer a barrier, and we have seen vulnerable people accessing support from areas of the county that we haven't reached before. We've also seen a complete change from most people finding out about us due to word of mouth to now finding out about us from searching online. We have and will learn from this, and I'm sure many charities and community groups will too. We know that in the weeks, months, and even years ahead, people will have been adversely affected by COVID in many ways, with poor mental health, increased unemployment and debt, as well as disconnected communities. Symptoms of addictions will increase, and this is the time to seek and receive that help from charities across Hertfordshire, such as ours. And I hope funders will support our missions to help reduce the needs of Hertfordshire citizens as the economy suffers and more people in distress seek our support. Thank you. Hand back to Helen.
Adrian, thank you very much for that. That's really great. The next theme in our report is crime and safety. And as stated in previous editions of Hertfordshire Matters, Hertfordshire does remain a relatively safe county, and we do have lower than average rates for most types of crime, but rates of shoplifting, vehicle crime and drug-related offences remain relatively high in some areas. Violent crime and antisocial behaviour are more concentrated around towns and city centres, while burglary and vehicle crime are greater issues in rural neighbourhoods. The county has also seen lower levels of domestic abuse than the regional average, and domestic abuse accounts for a lower proportion of total offences than average across England and Wales. But there's a huge caveat with that, which is, of course, we can only report on reported crimes, and we know that this is a particular type of crime which often goes unreported. If we just look at some headings on the next slide. Just click through. I think while COVID has actually led to a drop in certain types of crime like theft and burglary, we know that people living in a violent relationship or an abusive household have suffered hugely during this period, and this was also highlighted as a key concern in our recent survey, and it's an issue that we will be picking up going forwards with our grant making. We also know, yesterday I was exchanging emails with Future Living in Hertford just to ask them what impact COVID has had on their services, and they've seen a really significant increase in demand for the support they provide to people with addiction, and also they provide counselling and they support people experiencing domestic abuse. Since lockdown, they've supported 11 men and 213 women who've been referred to them for domestic abuse, which has specifically happened during lockdown. And of all those people, they've got really complex social needs ranging from poor mental health, emotional and physical abuse, isolation, lack of connectedness, and issues with housing and also their finances. 54 females have experienced increased domestic abuse during lockdown, and that's something that has been very sadly very well documented, and it's a national issue, and of course it's also here in Hertfordshire. If we now look at strong communities, we know where we live, and our sense of belonging and how we engage on both social and community level can have a huge impact on our health, our well-being and our general resilience. And by looking at indications including satisfaction levels, volunteering numbers, civil engagement and the strength and sustainability of the local voluntary sector, we can start to build a picture of what and where the strengths and opportunities lie. Hertfordshire has lower levels of belonging and satisfaction with the local area than the national average, and people living in rural areas tend to have a greater sense of belonging to their local area than more populated areas. Really good news for anyone who lives in Chorley Wood. I'm sure someone out there lives in Chorley Wood. It's reported to have the highest level of satisfaction with its local area. Hertfordshire has more charities per 1,000 population than anywhere in England, and we have about 3,500 registered charities, and we know there are plenty of groups whose income is perhaps lower than the Charities Commission threshold, and you don't have to be registered with the Charities Commission, so it's probably more like 5,000 groups and organisations out there. In our survey, we asked if respondents were working with more or less volunteers as a result of COVID, and if they had the capacity to work with more. 60% of groups out there are working with the same number as they were pre-lockdown, 30% are working with fewer, and 10 are working with more. And some organisations have volunteers that are 70 or over, so they've had to obviously shelter them and are therefore self-isolating. Just over half of responding organisations said that they did have the capacity to work with more volunteers. And it could be a really positive legacy of COVID if we're able to engage more people with volunteering going forwards. And of course, we appreciate some people will be returning to work, but it'd be a really great outcome. And just, I thought it'd be good to give you an example, if we click onto the next slide, of a grant that we awarded not so long ago. It was pre-lockdown, I have to say. Gratitude is a charity based in Bournemouth, and we provided a grant to enable them to purchase a van. And what they do is the van drives around, collects excess food from supermarkets which would otherwise go to landfill, and local volunteers cook and share meals with the community. And for us it's a fantastic project because it addresses food poverty, isolation, food waste, and any excess food that Gratitude has at the end of the day would ordinarily be taken to food banks and to night shelters. So it's just a really, I think, a fantastic example of a great community project. And if we now look at education and work, we know that a person's ability to reach their full potential and live well in their local community is dependent on a whole range of factors, from the quality of their education to the opportunities available to them in later life. As a county, Hertfordshire performs better than the average in nearly all areas of education, including educational attainment, employment levels and average earnings. And the proportion of people qualified to degree level is above the national average. However, there are, again, pockets of very, very high educational deprivation among children and young people. And there are 14 neighbourhoods in Hertfordshire ranked among the top 10% most deprived in England in terms of the children and young people education deprivation domain. Unemployment rates have also increased in Watford and Stevenage, drawing rates much closer to the national average, and Waltham Cross, which we've talked about previously, has the highest unemployment rate of the major towns in Hertfordshire at 1.5 times the national average. And of course, this was pre-COVID. The three largest job sectors in Hertfordshire are business administration and support services, professional, scientific and technical, and retail. And that's particularly significant at the moment. And it's an area that the Local Enterprise Partnership is looking into, because we know the retail industry has been hit very, very hard. And by looking at the sort of the key employment sectors, we can begin to project what unemployment figures could look like going forwards. And if we just look at some headlines, again, you'll have all seen these headlines, and there are plenty to choose from. The UK's GDP slumped by over 20% in April. And one of the main driving factors was the impact of COVID on the wholesale, retail and motor sectors, and of course other factors. And it's estimated by the Local Enterprise Partnership that around 21% of the local workforce has been furloughed. And the fall in economic output, combined with the end of the furlough scheme, which is coming up in October, is very likely to lead to an increase in local unemployment. And as we know, the knock-on effect of loss of income is really, really significant. As people fall into poverty, possibly for the first time, it will impact on homelessness, substance abuse, domestic violence, mental health, all the areas highlighted in our recent survey. And the Office of National Statistic data shows that the number of people claiming unemployment-related benefits increased by 69% here in Hertfordshire between March and April. And it just gives us a bit of a feel as to what's going to lie ahead. And again, the impact of school closures on education is yet to be determined. We've talked a little bit about that, but it has created an increase in the gap in educational attainment. And there is now this huge digital divide between those who have access to home study and those that don't. And nearly all private school children, it's estimated about 97% of children who are educated privately have access to broadband, IT equipment, whereas 1 in 5 children who has free school meals won't. It just increases that divide again, sadly. And then if we look at environment, Henry mentioned this is, we have touched on environment in previous reports, but this time it's got its own dedicated section, and it's because we acknowledge the importance of the environment to the county and to the population. CO2 emissions have reduced steadily since 2005, but Hertsmith, St Albans and Three Rivers are still above the England average. 6 out of 10 local authorities have higher levels of pollution than the national average. But Hertfordshire as a county is generally really good at recycling, and we tend to put far less into landfill, and we're good at composting and reusing things. So that's a very positive thing. And that brings me to a close in terms of the themes, but I just wanted to say a couple of words about HCF and looking forwards and what we're going to be doing. So we very recently published guidelines on our new grant making, following on from our sort of rapid response emergency relief grant making. So please do have a look at our website. We're now offering grants of £5, £10 and £20,000. The £20,000 grants, we don't anticipate making a huge number of them, but they are for partnership projects. So please have a look at the criteria, and we will continue working with the National Emergencies Trust for as long as we are given that opportunity. Looking at the wider voluntary sector, I have a feeling it's going to be quite a tough 24 months ahead. A survey published this week by the Institute of Fundraising, the NCVO and the Charity Finance Group has estimated that charities will face a £12.4 billion income shortfall just this year, and that doesn't even look to the next year. And our local survey showed that while 60% of respondents said their charity or organisation could financially survive the next 6 to 12 months, that means there's about 40% of local groups who may not survive or weather this storm. And I think our greatest concern is that there is a really significant contraction in the local voluntary sector to a point where people don't have access to the vital services they need. And we know at HCF that we support really small grassroots organisations. You may not know they exist until you personally, someone in your family needs to access that help. So HCF is really committed to working very hard to do the best we can with the funds we have to support as many groups and organisations as possible. And if you are aware of groups and organisations you think would qualify for HCF funding, please do put them in touch with us. I'm now really delighted to hand you over to Louise Maron, who is our project manager for HCF training and development, who will oversee the questions and answers session.
Hello. So thank you for everyone for joining us today. This is your opportunity now to put some questions to our panel. So on our panel, we will have the speakers who you've already heard from, and also Helen DeBow, who is our grants lead, will be joining the panel as well. So yes, you can put any questions in the Q&A box. We'll try and answer as many as we can. We are due to finish up around 4. Any questions that we can't answer now, we will endeavour to respond to after the session. So please do put your questions in. We'll answer as many as we can in the time that we have. I'm just going to make sure that all of our panelists' videos are on so that we can get going. And maybe we can start Helen Gray. We have a question.
Louise, just to let you know, I unfortunately can't hear you.
Okay. Okay,
so I have to be on my phone to answer a question.
Okay, I was actually coming to you now. Well, the first question I was going to ask that we've had put through is, I guess COVID-19 and lockdown has been on everyone's minds recently. So how will HCF's grant funding change as lockdown eases?
Hello, I'd be delighted to answer that one. Can you hear me? Because I can't see me. Great. At the moment, we are still responding to the need. We're responding to the need that we've identified in the survey, and we still have some funds to do that, and we will continue doing that as long as it lasts. We've put our normal round for the foundation grants on hold, but we're going to be reviewing that a bit later this summer to see whether we can continue with it. We still have our normal PCC grants, and we still have our normal #IWill grants, but we feel very strongly that we'll continue to be informed by the need as it emerges, so that when we do get to the point where we're no longer managing to make a grants round every single week and we go back to longer term grants rounds, we will still be addressing the needs that have arisen from the crisis, because we know from our survey and national research that they're fairly long term.
Another question. What would enable HCF to increase its impact going forward? So perhaps Henry, I'm not sure if you can touch on that one.
Well, really, I think I mean, we have a wonderful background of endowment funds, which we're drawing on every year. Obviously, this year we've got to be very careful with our funds not to go over any income which we're drawing off of funds, because obviously the balances of those funds have been hard hit by the downturn in the investment markets. And our pass-through funding is continuing to come in. We're very grateful for that. The National Emergency Trust has obviously helped us hugely. We're thrilled that we've been able to help the charities which we have helped so far, and that will be going forward. Actually, as Helen just said, we don't want to release all the funding we have at the moment straight away, because we do need to be cautious about what may be coming around the corner. And charities are very much in need now, but charities will be even more in need as we go into the autumn and the early winter. So we are kind of measuring our funding distribution quite carefully to ensure that we can help everybody, not just everyone who applies now, but thinking ahead for the future as well. So if you're working with a charity or voluntary sector organisation and you're thinking about your future and your current reserves, we will hopefully be able to help you later in the year as well. We're not using up all our resources now. This is ongoing, and we want to be able to see everybody through to the end of 2020 and on into 21.
Thank you. Another question now that's come through from Charles Sherwood. Homelessness is clearly a huge and growing problem, but what causes it, and is it really lack of housing? So a difficult one there. I don't know if Helen DeBow, perhaps you can touch on that one.
I'm very happy to start off, and I'm sure Helen would like to chip in as well. We've been looking for quite a while at the underlying...
Hello, so I can...
Oh, sorry. Hello. We've been looking at the underlying causes of housing homelessness, and they are, again, some of the familiar issues that have arisen just recently from our survey. So obviously, poverty, lack of employment, mental health issues, family breakdowns. These are recurring themes that local authorities have learned about when people are being evicted. So it's a whole basket of disadvantage, and lots of groups that we fund, such as the CABs, try and address these issues to help prevent homelessness. And indeed, last year we were working with Nationwide to make grants specifically to help prevent homelessness, and a lot of it focused around support and advice early on so that people didn't end up being evicted.
Thank you, Helen. We've had some more questions coming through now, so thank you. A couple of different people have asked similar questions around technology. So perhaps if I take the one here, Janice Wing, who says, I'm the chair of a U3A and I'm looking for practical help for older members who are not digitally competent and are now more isolated through lack of engagement. We also had a similar comment from Paul Moser, who said, I'd be interested to hear more about how organisations have helped elderly to embrace technology. It's the same issues with some learning disabled people.
I'm happy to answer that one too. We have identified this as a particular issue to be addressed, and we would be very happy to support groups who are able to come up with support for other groups. I know that the group Computer Friendly, who operates in St Albans, has been working with lots of different organisations in partnership to try and address this. I know that it's still a big issue, especially for older people, and it's almost impossible for people with dementia. I think possibly if those people who've asked the questions want to drop me an email, I'll be more than happy to try and link them up with anybody I know who's working on it at the moment.
Can I just add something there, that I think it's been extraordinary how generous people have been with old mobile phones, old tablets, old laptops, which I've seen handed in, especially through the hospices appeal, and the number of bits of electronic equipment which have been distributed around hospices to help elderly people keep in touch with their kin and next of their families. I also, in talking to charities who've received HCF grants during the COVID time, a large amount of that money has been spent on buying electronic equipment, buying laptops to keep people in touch. And that's a really good use of what these funds are for. So I congratulate all those charities that have been able to think ahead like that and bring elderly people back into the network, which they might otherwise be missing out on.
And just following that, some of the organisations that have been doing really well with that, some of the CVSs, I know Communities First, delivering a digital champion project, and I know Claire Pullen mentioned in East Herts they're working on a project around digital inclusion. So there are projects out there who are working on this. Helen, did you have something you wanted to add? No? Okay.
No, thank you. Yes, I picked up, of course, the CBSs are doing that. So it is good to share that. Thank you.
I just have a question here from Nigel Farron. It's an interesting one. Herts receives less than half the national average grant funding per head. Given this, what steps are being taken to seek financial support for the vulnerable from high net worth individuals in the county? So Helen, I'm not sure, again, sorry, if you're able to answer that.
Is that me? Can Helen hear that one? Because Helen's probably got a good answer to that one. Other Helen? No, maybe she can't hear. Well, we're continuing to get, I know that we've got a huge development programme and we need as much as we can possibly get to address this. It's partly because Hertfordshire is very densely populated, I suspect, that we don't get as much, and also possibly because we're perceived as an affluent county, although of course we have pockets of deprivation. So it's very much work in progress to try and get more money in for the county and the foundation. Thank you.
Just moving on to a slightly different topic now. There's a comment from Alex Lang actually asking, my not-for-profit organisation has suffered a loss due to COVID, yet I find no funding available for goods paid for last year, and with no income this year to cover that cost. Is any of the funding still available that might be used to cover this loss?
I think the best thing is for Alex to give us a call afterwards or get in touch, and we can talk more specifically about his exact situation and exact needs. It's difficult to give a very specific answer without knowing the details. I hope we can help.
Actually, Adrian, we have a question for you now. What have been the learnings for the living room from adapting your operating model from face-to-face to online?
Well, the learning is how quickly people have adapted, because we've wanted to go digital, and I suspect quite a lot of people have thought, you know, this is the way we want to go, and we had to do it overnight. So for us, there was a quick turnaround in suddenly becoming a digital organisation. But for clients, it isn't the same as face-to-face, but it does give you an alternative. So when we, you know, return to a normal of face-to-face groups, I think we will still have an element of digital, and also ensuring that communication online is current and up to date, because that is how people are finding out things. So for us, it's definitely being tech savvy, but also helping people, because people have the want, but they don't always have the skill. So sometimes we've had to hold their hand right through from click this button, type in here, but they've got to that point, and then they've said to us, now that's opened up, are there opportunities for me? I can now go on to fellowships, because those groups are online as well. So it is labour intensive, but actually it's very rewarding for both the client and us as an organisation, because it's not just to serve our needs, but also for them to open up their world a bit more.
We've still got time for a couple more, I think. There's again a sort of theme coming through here about grant funding going forward. An anonymous question put forward: the pull forward of grant funding is an issue for charities trying to survive, but also planning for a positive future. What opportunity might there be for longer term funding from HCF? And there's also, yeah, I don't know if you can help with that, Helen, perhaps?
I can now hear. I promised it wasn't elaborate.
Helen Gray's back.
It wasn't an elaborate way of getting out of the Q&As, I promise. It's a really, really good point, and Helen and the grants team and I were working very hard. So at the moment, a lot of our funding is coming from the National Emergencies Trust, and we are slightly restricted by their criteria, but we as a community foundation network are pushing them very hard to say that actually we're not in the immediate sort of emergency response phase, we're now looking at longer term. And actually one of the things Helen and I and the grants team would like to do more than anything is be able to provide repeat funding, so that, you know, for the next 3 years you've got X £1,000 or whatever it might be. But as I say, we are slightly restricted at the moment by the criteria set by NET. With the funds that we've raised ourselves, which whilst we've done well, we would like to raise more, we can be more flexible.
Thank you, Helen. And good to have you back. So we have another question on behalf of Daisy Cooper. Do we have any ideas of how COVID-19 may affect those employed within the Hertfordshire charity sector following lockdown and the end of the furlough scheme? Are there predicted to be redundancies that you know of?
It's a brilliant question, Daisy. It's lovely to have you online. I've been stalking you a bit on Twitter, so thank you. We don't, in all honesty, we don't have statistics on projected employment in the charity sector going forwards. It is something I could come back to you on. As I said, the Local Enterprise Partnership is looking very closely at commercial employment. We know in Hertfordshire, because there are over probably 5,000 charities and organisations, that we are a significant player in the local economy. But Helen DeBell, I don't know whether you've got anything you could add. I think I'd be really happy to come back to you, Daisy, on that. It's a good question.
Yes, no, I don't, except that obviously there is a prediction that a lot of charities won't survive and a lot will have to reduce. So I know that we're working on it, or certainly the LEP is, and we're expecting to have to provide support to those who are left.
As our survey said, 40% of charities don't necessarily have the funding to see them beyond the next 12 months. And if that's an indication to go by, then yes, there will definitely, I'm sure there will be redundancies in the sector, sadly.
So another question from Robert Boss, welcome. Is there a feeling that the needs of the county will be very different as people's work and daily living arrangements change post-COVID-19? I guess it's quite a similar question.
Did you want to take that one?
I'm very happy to answer. I think that definitely things will change. The question is how they will change. I'm absolutely sure that there will be differences which we will see through the charity and voluntary sector in terms of job redundancies, in terms of homelessness, in terms of people that have partnerships and marriages which may have come under huge stress under the lockdown, and people moving out and trying to find alternative accommodation. I think there will be a lot of big issues, especially for the homeless charities, as we go forward. Exactly where this will lead us, time will tell, but I can absolutely see there are going to be a lot of new challenges to face for all of us as we go forward after this year and into next year. And in the financial side, I think that there are grim times ahead for so many people, especially in the charity sector. I've certainly heard of charities which are struggling in terms of the reserves they've got. Will they be able to keep going much longer without some form of real support? The fundraising, which so many charities rely on, especially in the summer months, hasn't been able to take place. So their annual budgets are being really hard hit and cut drastically in order to keep going. So exactly where the challenges are, we don't know, but there are going to be a number of new challenges ahead for us, yes.
I guess if we're still okay for maybe a couple more before we finish up. Another theme that is coming through that I guess a lot of organisations are worried about or looking for reassurance about is looking for longer term funding. Will HCF be looking towards a move from survival to growth funding and longer term funding going forward?
Yes, I mean, it's a similar answer probably to the previous answer, which is yes, we would love to be able to provide year-on-year funding, and some of our grant programmes like the St Albans Fund for the Future does allow for that. Having been a fundraiser, I know the value of having some secure funding year after year. But at the moment, our main source of funding is the National Emergencies Trust. And as I said, we are restricted. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing organisation that's raised an incredible sum of money in a very short space of time. But we are restricted by their criteria, as we are with some of our local donors as well. But Helen and I will continue to lobby to be in a position to provide more repeat funding where we can.
I just wanted to clarify that because it was coming up a few times. So I think we're almost ready to finish up, but we've had a couple of similar questions again about helping to join up charities within the sector. So is there a way that HCF can help by joining up charities who offer similar services? Someone mentioned an idea about buddying up charities, and we also had a comment from Carmen. You've highlighted that a large percentage of grassroots charities may not survive following COVID-19. What plans do HCF have to continue to build knowledge and resilience for smaller charities, so it's to underpin their survival?
Well,
lots of questions. You go first, Helen.
I was going to say the last question is for Louise as much as anything with HCF training, because I know you're working really hard on supplying the sort of training and support that is coming down the line as an absolute necessity. But going back to partnerships, we definitely are encouraging partnerships. We're encouraging partnerships for several reasons. Firstly, with the net funding to help effectively deliver services. And we've seen examples of groups getting together more than they have before, usually with complementary services rather than people with the same services getting together, but making sure that there isn't duplication and making sure they're all serving a beneficiary so nobody gets overlooked. We will obviously continue to encourage that as much as we can, but training and development, I think, is a really useful key to that.
And actually, I would just add, through the grant making, when the grants team assess applications, they are really, really good at identifying similar or like-minded projects and encouraging people to talk.
We do,
And,
yes.
and ordinarily, when we can host networking opportunities, one of the reasons why we do it is to encourage groups to meet and to share best practice, and where possible, remove duplication if it is duplication.
We're having a lot of questions coming through. We're just not going to be able to cover them all. So I think we'll finish up there. What we will say is, especially in the last 5 minutes, a lot of really key important questions are starting to come through. We will get back to you on those. So we will respond with answers by email throughout the rest of the week. So thank you so much for those. And I'll just pass you back to Henry now to just finish off the session.
Thank you very much, Louise, and thank you for everybody on the panel there for answering those questions. And one of the joys of this virtual technology is we have all the questions on our Q&A chat. We will go through those and we will answer all the ones which have come in. So we will get back to you. Just in closing, I would just like to say a few thank yous to the magnificent team actually at HCF. I think first of all, who've put all the work into making Hertfordshire Matters and coordinating the research. They have been busy over the last 3 months, I can assure you. We didn't quite realise how busy we would all be when the NET Trust fundraising kicked off, but I can't tell you how good it's been for us to be able to do all this work and get the money out to the charities, and how busy it's kept us. So nobody in the HCF team has been sitting around, but particular thanks to Helen Gray, who's put a huge amount of work into today's presentation, to Helen Dubal, our head of grants, who with her team have been flat out, as I say, over the last few months, and to our marketing coordinator, Danielle Hood, for also helping a lot with today and putting together the presentations. And also, I must say thank you to our trustees and especially the members of our Research and Impact Committee, who've also put a lot of work into producing the Hertfordshire Matters report. A quick mention again to our two sponsors. We wouldn't have been able to do this without them, CCLA and the John Apthorpe charity. So very many thanks to them. And if any of their representatives have joined us, again, we are most grateful. You will all receive an electronic copy of the Hertfordshire Matters report by the end of the week. Our donors and regular supporters, for whom we hold addresses, will receive a printed copy in the next few weeks. If you would like a printed copy of the report, we probably don't have your address, so please email us at HCF, giving your name and address, and we will send you one of the printed reports. Now, none of you would expect a presentation by a charity not to include a small plug for our work, and I've kept this to the end. A colleague from the voluntary sector reminded me this week of the words of Mother Teresa. Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. And I speak, if any of you would like more information about what we do, please speak to our team. We would love to hear from you. We are still collecting for our COVID appeal to assist charities in Hertfordshire. Our Love Hearts programme continues to run as normal for pass-through funding, and that's the funding which hits the ground where it is most needed as quickly as possible. Or if you would like to talk to us about becoming an HCF donor, or know of others who might be interested in our long-term objectives to provide for the charity sector in Hertfordshire, then please contact us either any of us in person or through our website. And finally, we did just touch on in the Q&A training and development. We have a wonderful training and development team, ably managed by Louise Marin, who's just been hosting the Q&A. We're running a number of courses and programs to assist charities with administration, good practice, board and trustee training, and many other topics. This guidance and training has been ongoing through the lockdown by way of a number of very useful webinars, and it will continue. So please contact Louise at HCF if you're an organisation who would like to join any of our training and development courses, webinars, seminars in the future. We'd be delighted to see you and hear from you. So thank you everybody who's joined us this afternoon. We very much enjoyed presenting to you. I hope you take away some good and valuable information about our wonderful county of Hertfordshire, and you will receive a copy of our report shortly. Thank you very much indeed.